All right, I reckon we should make a start. So hello everyone and welcome to this session about the history of mutual aid. Just to say who I am, my name is Sayo. I am an organizer. I've also done a lot of writing on prefigurative politics and people helping each other in a very practical way as a form of political organizing. And I'm also an academic. I work at King's College London teaching politics on their foundation course. There's also Matthew here on the call who's from Neon. Hello, hope you can see him. I just wanted to say, if you have any things that come up that don't feel okay, or if you feel you need to talk to someone about something, please do message Matthew privately in the chat, and you can either chat there or go into a breakout room. What we're going to do today is we'll start by, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, just outlining the history of mutual aid and what mutual aid is, what's distinctive about it. Then we're going to go into smaller groups and I'll give you some questions to discuss. And then also just a heads up, we're going to feed back into the full group as well. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you will certainly be invited to do so. So, all right, let's get started. So, mutual aid, a concept that has suddenly become highly relevant again. As now, last thing I heard, there were 3,400 mutual aid groups across the UK in this brand new COVID mutual aid network, which is just staggeringly huge. It's amazing. The estimate of how many individuals are involved is something like 3 million people. Which is incredible. So this concept of mutual aid has suddenly, become really relevant for us again, which is why we want to look into it a bit more now. So I started looking into what would be the starting point of mutual aid, when did it, mutual aid start? And of course, it didn't have a starting point at all. It's more like, when did mutual aid being the norm, stop? And when did not mutual aid start as the dominant kind of principle of society? Because mutual aid, if we understand it as sharing resources, helping each other without payment, that's something that's been around for basically as long as the human species has been around, which is about 200,000 years, and has been the dominant form of kind of how we interact with each other in our society for most of that time. And I guess the sort of the period when it stopped being the dominant form, at least in Britain and in what we now call the Western world, is around the time that farming came in, agriculture. So around 9,000 years ago in central sort of Mediterranean region, or 7,000 years ago here in the UK. And so the basic principle of sharing and sharing resources without payment became replaced by various forms of payment and debt systems. And basically, people started to hoard wealth and inequalities started arising. But of course, along this whole period, along this whole history, mutual aid has always been there. It's never stopped. So it's always been part of human society. We only know about the formal institutions that govern mutual aid since writing came in, basically. So we have a bit of history on that. I'm not going to go into detail, but I've looked into the archives, and there's stuff around kind of work, mutual aid organizing, where people share farm work together, where there's kind of what we now have as a welfare state, people sharing between each other in ancient civilizations. There's also people coming together for rituals and partying. That has a really rich history in terms of the formal institutions of mutual aid. And also, of course, religious organization. And then if we fast forward through history a little bit more, from the 1700s in Britain, if we focus on Britain specifically, friendly societies are kind of the dominant form of mutual aid organization. So this is where people, mostly farmers, share a kind of a percentage of their income every month, or however often. And then they can just go and take resources from there if there's any problems, if someone dies or if they lose their house or something like that. So that has a really rich history of friendly societies in the UK, and they basically were the dominant form of mutual aid right about until the welfare state came up. And there's a bit of, so we're talking sort of early 1900s, like 1910, 1911. And there's a bit of a debate among historians there about whether the welfare states destroyed and took over from mutual aid, or whether it was a much more symbiotic relationship. But yeah, obviously mutual aid is something that's been around for a lot longer than we have history, and it's something that's still the dominant form of, like, basic principle of societies that are not capitalist or not farming societies, whether it's indigenous societies, like, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution, the law of peace, is founded on mutual aid principles, collaboration between different societies. And there are many, many other examples as well. But I think the term mutual aid specifically became particularly influential with this guy, Peter Kropotkin, the famous anarchist thinker who wrote this book. Actually, it's a series of essays in the late 1800s, and then it became a book in, I think, 1901 or something like that. It was published as a book. Might be wrong about the specific dates. And so he actually used the term mutual aid in a slightly different connotation. Here he's talking about biology, because Kropotkin, before he was interested in political theory, was a biologist. He was active with the army in Siberia and did a lot of research there. And so his essays that form this book basically argue that Darwin's theory of evolution, or particularly the way in which Darwinists or social Darwinists have used this theory of evolution, has been really biased and based on certain liberal and Hobbesian assumptions. The idea that people are individuals and self-interested, and that there's a war of all against all. What Kropotkin pointed out is that this is not a scientific finding. This is an assumption that Darwinists use when they interpret Darwin's findings, and Darwin himself to some extent as well. So what Kropotkin saw when he looked at all types of different species, from birds to horses to lions to all sorts of different species, he found a huge amount of cooperation within the species, and sometimes between species as well. So he basically makes an argument that cooperation, in fact, underpins societies, animal societies as well as human societies. And then he went on to develop a kind of more political anarchist theory from that. But it started out as just a work in biology. So that's really where the term comes from now, in the connotation that we tend to use it in now, is in the sense of this notion that cooperation underpins human society, and that we simply can't survive without cooperation. So that it's a basic understanding of how society works, a structural understanding of how society works, if you will. And so that was in the early 1900s. And since then, the term mutual aid has been used by loads of different people in loads of different contexts. But the thread, I think, that goes through it, and we'll look at the characteristics of it in a while. But it's always predominantly been used by revolutionary radical left organizations. So anarchist activism is one really dominant strand of people who have been doing mutual aid over the last 100 years. The picture there is an example of Food Not Bombs. In fact, it's the North London Food Not Bombs that I've been volunteering for a bit. So what they do is they get waste food from kind of markets or shops that have surplus, and they get volunteers to cook food and give it away for free, and basically have stalls, or they can sometimes do in a community center, and people come and eat. And then as they sit and eat, the idea is they start to talk and they start to share experiences and insights, and it becomes something more community building. There's also a huge history of mutual aid in Black organizing, and I think the most famous example is the Black Panther Party in the US. And I think what makes that such a good example is that not only did they do mutual aid, and we'll watch a video in a second of the breakfast program that they ran, but the Black Panthers were, of course, also organizing in lots of other ways as well. They were running for political office. They were protesting in the streets. They were, forming armed sort of self-defense groups to protect themselves against the incredible violence from the police, you know, that we largely, or to a large extent, still see today. And so for them, it was really about, the mutual aid was really about unifying a whole set of different approaches, like a diversity of tactics, we could call it. So not just doing one single thing, but trying to create change on a systemic level on a much broader, throughout using many different tactics. And I think this is really important for understanding mutual aid, as we'll get to in a second. But I just want to show, technology permitting here, I want to show a short clip from a film called Black Panther's Vanguard of the Revolution. And hopefully the technology will work. It's where Bobby Seale, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, talks about the breakfast program that they're running. So let's see if I can get the film up.
We have a film of your breakfast program. Is this without sound also?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Would you comment on?
This is a free breakfast for children program, and they're preparing the food there early in the morning. It's about 2 hours work in the morning. These party members primarily set this whole program up, and then we involve as many of the community people as we can.
Who I want here? People in there. Come on in, little brother. Come on in, little sister. Y'all can sit down and get something to eat.
Studies came out saying that children that didn't have a good breakfast in the morning were less attentive at school and less inclined to do well and suffered from fatigue. I mean, there was all sorts of scientific reasons to have a good breakfast in the morning. And we just simply took that information and a program was developed serving breakfast to children.
After my father came home from Vietnam and was discharged from the Army and couldn't get work, we were going through a very hard time. Food was kind of, you know, just the everyday necessities were hard. I was embarrassed to go, but when you went, you know, kids are all laughing, and then all of a sudden the stigma, or whatever you thought was a stigma, went away, and you really got to see that, yes, this is what the Black Panthers are.
We were showing love for our people. You know, if you have a child, if you know that, hey, these men and women are going to feed my child in the morning, that's a big deal.
The breakfast program actually really caught on. It served about 20,000 meals a week to young people in 19 different communities. So it wasn't a fly-by-night thing. It really actually was making a difference.
All right, let's do this. Yeah, so that's a really classic example of a mutual aid program. And I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but actually the Black Panthers also had a British arm. They had a chapter in Brixton in South London, where, which squatted a building for a while and provided some mutual aid services there as well. And in feminist history and organizing, there is a huge history of mutual aid as well. Far too many examples to go through. The picture that I put in there is from a Black women's mutual aid project in Manchester from the late 1960s. This is Kath Locke and a few other activists who were actually linked to the Brixton chapter of the Black Panther Party through Olive Morris. because Olive Morris was active in the British Black Panthers, and then she moved to Manchester to study, and then she was part of setting up a few organizations there. I was going to put in a picture of Olive Morris in the slides, but I realized I got a really awesome picture of her already, which is from Jacob V. Joyce's calendar from 2018. If anyone's got that at home as well, I know quite a few people do. There she is. And finally, that mutual aid has, of course, been a huge part of disaster relief. And so Occupy Sandy, I think, is the most recent, most famous example. I mean, if, COVID is its own example. But I think Occupy is particularly interesting because they also connect the mutual aid, sort of the, just supplying people with the stuff that they need to survive a disaster, with like a broader political platform. And, I think there's a reason why they chose to use the word Occupy and the kind of network of Occupy activists, which is really, I think, really helps us understand the concept of mutual aid really well. There's also tons and tons of other examples. There's, the sex work organizing history, there's disability rights activism, LGBT and HIV/AIDS, mutual aid. There's just so many examples. But I think it's really important to understand mutual aid as a radical left and a revolutionary like concept and practice. In terms of a definition of what mutual aid is, there are lots of different ones, but I think this one is particularly good. It's from Dean Spade, who is, I would say, probably the biggest kind of thinker and commentator on mutual aid right now. He's done a ton of lectures and talks, and he's also done a video that is really helpful, but quite US centric on mutual aid, which you can find at bigjawbrigade.com, which is his community's collective's kind of website. And so the definition that he has is mutual aid projects are a form of political participation. So already here we see that it's not just people giving each other food, not just people giving each other food or other supplies. It's a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, not just through symbolic acts or putting pressure on their representatives in government, but by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. Bit of a long definition, but I think it's because he's trying to get in all of these important parts of mutual aid, that it's a form of political participation, that you're not just caring for one another, but also changing political conditions so that you understand the causes of people's problems as being, at least to a large extent, political. And that mutual aid can happen in conjunction with other forms of putting pressure on representatives in government or trying to change politics in other ways. What I'd like to do next is just to really summarize what the characteristics of mutual aid are, because I think this is really useful for us to think about the current COVID mutual aid group network that's come up, to really think about whether and how these mutual aid groups, the COVID mutual aid groups, are kind of fulfilling their full potential, which is also what we're going to discuss in a bit. So the first thing to note really is that mutual aid is egalitarian. And here mutual aid, I think, is easiest understood if we understand it in opposition to charity, because people often confuse mutual aid with charity being a very similar thing. But mutual aid is at heart egalitarian. So it's not about the weak being helped by the strong. It's not about somebody who's so rich that they can show off their wealth by sort of like endowing the poor with and being so kind and generous. It's not about all of this stuff. It's about understanding, based on Kropotkin's initial idea, understanding that we need each other. We are the same. We are part of the same social system, and we help each other out. Like, that's the basic principle. It's about seeing our lives as dependent on each other. You don't give because you want power or control or to show your wealth. You give because it's an injustice that we don't all have the same already. It's an injustice that some people have more resources than other people. The other really important thing about mutual aid is that it's not conditional, right? Because with charity, it's usually the case that you can get help if you fulfill certain criteria, if you're suffering in a particular way, if you look like you're suffering in a particular way, in a convincing way, if you don't have addictions, if you stop doing a certain job, if you stop hanging out with certain people, and so on and so forth. So it's very conditional in nature. One example I wanted to show of charity is, based in London here, but if you've ever been on the Overground in London, you've probably seen these signs, right? To help someone you see begging on London Overground, donate to Whitechapel Mission. Any donations will be used carefully and your generosity will be welcomed. As in, this is implying that if you give to a homeless person in cash, then your donations will not be used carefully. So it's kind of this idea that, you know, I'm sure you all know this narrative very well, but if you give money to someone begging, then they will go and spend it in some unwise way, or they won't do with the money what you want them to do with the money. This is a very kind of charity way of understanding donations, that you give in order to reform the recipient, rather than giving because it is an injustice that they don't have as much as you. Whereas I wanted to give a kind of a positive example of a mutual aid project on the other hand. There's a group that's been around for a really long, quite a few years now, called UK Mutual Aid, which is, as you can see from the screenshot, it's a Facebook group. And it's not a COVID-19 specific group, never was. It existed long before this COVID situation. And basically how this group works is that people just post, I need some cash, I need it right now, I need it by this particular day. And then if they like, they can write more about themselves or what they're going to spend it on if they like. And then people can just go in and donate. So there's no strings attached. You never check what somebody spends their money on. You just give it out of the sense that you are equal and it's unconditional. As I mentioned, mutual aid is also focused on systemic causes. I think this is a very, very important thing to understand. And so it's not about, you know, people are suffering because they've made bad choices, or people are they just happen to be in a risk group for COVID and therefore we have to help them. It's about taking a step back and seeing on a structural level what's going on here. Actually, why are some people disadvantaged? Why are some people more vulnerable than others? You know, in a one way, it seems quite obvious that it's a virus that is making people sick, not society. But if you start thinking about it, if you start thinking about why some people don't have the resources they need to get through it, then we soon realize that it's all about society and it's all about politics. You know, the whole reason why we're in a lockdown situation in the first place is to make sure that the NHS doesn't flood, right? And doesn't kind of stretch its resources too much. So this is a wholly systemic crisis. It is completely about resource distribution. And so, so what mutual aid groups tend to do is to link up with activist groups that are part of kind of a broader movement ecology of organizations. That's why I wanted to show the example of the Black Panthers, because I think they did that particularly well. And let's go on and discuss in the discussion a bit later, you know, whether the COVID groups are doing that in a kind of successful way. Finally, I wanted to mention on the kind of characteristics of mutual aid, that mutual aid is federally organized, it's horizontally organized. And for me as an anarchist, this is particularly important and particularly exciting, because I think that the structure that we've seen develop now with mutual aid groups in the COVID response could very well potentially become a kind of infrastructure for democratizing society more generally. Let me explain what I mean. So federalism is the idea that you have a multi-layered setup of representation and basically decision-making. So I'll give an example of my mutual aid group. I live in Hackney in London, one of the London boroughs. There's, I think, about 10,000 people in the Hackney mutual aid, kind of Hackney-wide mutual aid group on Facebook. That's a lot of people. Difficult to make your voice heard there. But then the Hackney group is divided into different wards. There's can't remember how many, but something like 10 or 12 or something like that, different wards all across Hackney. So decisions are made there, and there's something like 200 people per ward. So we, in my ward, we decided what our poster was going to look like that we put up, and how we're going to allow people to contact us to, you know, get in touch if they needed help from us. So we decided we were going to use a phone number, and people were going to rotate that phone between different volunteers to kind of man that phone and pass on their requests. And then the ward is divided further into zones. So this is a map of the 5 different zones in my ward, in my borough. And so each ward, each zone is allowed to make decisions as well. And then within each ward, you have different neighborhoods. So actually, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is my neighborhood. This is my housing estate. And on my housing estate, there's 5 people at the moment in the mutual aid group, and I'm the coordinator for my housing estate. So we are also very free to make our own decisions about anything we like. We can just ignore the poster and make our own poster if we like, or we can use another way for people to contact us than the phone. So this is a multi-layered, direct, participatory, democratic decision-making structure where we all have as much input as we like. And this is a very kind of typical anarchist way of organizing, a very typical mutual aid way of organizing, that is federated and participatory democratic. I do also want to add, though, that mutual aid is unfortunately not perfect, and this is what we're here to discuss to some extent as well. So I think when we look at the COVID mutual aid groups, there are questions to ask around, especially, do we really have a systemic kind of cause understanding of why people are suffering from the COVID crisis? I definitely have, and I know that a lot of activists in the mutual aid groups have. But from the discussions that have been happening in more broadly, I would say in my ward's WhatsApp group and in the Facebook group for Hackney ward, for Hackney Borough at least, there are a lot of people who claim that, you know, mutual aid is not political and we shouldn't be discussing any political or power-related questions. And I wonder if you found the same for people who've been involved in mutual aid groups, or if you've seen that debate happening somewhere. So, you know, because there is a lot of charity going around, I think, in the mutual aid groups, what do we kind of do with that? And does that limit the, I don't know, revolutionary potential, if you're so inclined, of the mutual aid network that we're seeing now? Because there's always the risk that it becomes depoliticized and that people just see it as a very simple exchange of support, and without connecting it to this broader understanding of what mutual aid really is. I think another unrelated limitation that we might be seeing in the mutual aid groups right now is that there's some co-optation happening by local authorities. So in one of my friends' mutual aid groups, it's basically been completely taken over by councillors, particularly councillors from the Labour Party, because that happens to be the party in charge in that borough or in that ward. And so basically that mutual aid group was started up by a bunch of activists living locally, but then it was kind of taken over by the Labour Party, and now it's just fulfilling a service and almost kind of providing free social services for the local council. So instead of having the council paying staff to do things like go shopping for each other or for people who need it, or providing food, volunteers are doing it. So it's kind of like the mutual aid group has become like a free service provider that the council uses, which is a little bit questionable, partly because it's a little bit exploitative potentially. You know, you can't provide the correct kind of services and support that you should for people who are doing those jobs. And partly because people don't have democratic say anymore. So it's just turned into something quite centralized and quite controlled by the Labour Party. So I think that's really something that we need to think about when we're doing mutual aid, because it can be really difficult to react to this in an informed way and to make sure that you don't get exploited by or co-opted by government. So I wanted to put that out there as well as a thing to think about.